This week we've gotten news of the death of Nelson Mandela, the founder of modern black-governed South Africa, a man who was governed for 27 years and emerged as the first president. A second news item, seemingly of less importance, is the fact that state troopers for the first time ticketed a driver for driving while wearing Google glasses, which enabled the driver to use the web while driving. Now, these two items don't sound of similar importance or that they have any relationship, but actually they come together with Parshas Vayigash. Yosef, when he tells his brothers and gives them instructions about returning to Eretz Canaan, says three words: Al tirgazu baderach. And Rashi has various insights into what the intent of these words is. Don't be berogez, anger, anxiety, danger on the way. The first Rashi stresses is safety. Safety while traveling. You know, it's interesting that this is not a topic that the frum world looks upon as part of our frumkeit. But we do find this idea right here by Yosef telling his brothers. And the care that people are supposed to live with when they travel is embodied in a story about Rav Shach. One day Rav Shach and the Talmud hailed a cab, and they enter the cab driver is a frum person. He sees the great Rosh Hashiv Rav Shach, and he says, I would love to share some divrei Torah with you, to which Rav Shach says, if you're driving, you have to keep your concentration on the road. And the person protests, because I'm a cab driver, I don't get to hear something from Rav Shach. So Rav Shach said, so I'll tell you a maisa. So he told them a story about Rav Yisrael Salanta. And when Rav Shach finished, he mentioned to the cab driver again, you should know when it comes to actual learning Torah, which requires concentration, it is forbidden to talk to a person driving a car at all. There was another story that when Rav Shach was driving with somebody and they came to railroad tracks and you have to stop as required by law, this driver just looked both ways before coming to a full stop and continued. So Rav Shach said, please let me out. So they said, what's happening? He says, it's forbidden by the Torah, it's an Issur D'Oraisa to drive for even a short distance with a driver who does not fully observe the traffic regulations. Interesting, huh? A new kind of frumkeit. And similarly, one time Rav Shach was asked by a Jew who was called to testify in an Israeli secular court about another person who wasn't driving carefully, and he felt a little bit hesitant about going to a secular court to testify against another Jew. After all, they're not going to judge this case according to Torah. And Rav Shach told him he was permitted and desirable to testify in this case als tikkun olam, to benefit society, to prevent drivers from driving irresponsibly. And Rav Shach said further, even if the court would give him a monetary payment not in keeping with Torah law, he said it probably would be permitted to testify in such a case, but in that he said we still have to ask another paisek. But he took this very seriously. If a person is driving dangerously, so it can't just be ignored. There's a story with Rav Aaron, similarly, who was driving with a Talmud who was speeding. Rav Aaron said, stop, I want to get out of the car. Okay, so we understand that this is important. This is one aspect of Al tirgazu baderach, that a person should drive safely. And that's what Yosef is telling his brothers, according to one pshat in Rashi, that make sure you don't travel at night, because after all, there are no paved roads, you could fall into a hole, even though Yosef himself was put into a hole. He's worried about his brothers, and he tells them you have to travel safely. Now, a second aspect of traveling safely is not only paying attention, but not reacting with anger when some fellow driver does something that's not so nice to us, like cutting us off. And when road rage becomes the issue, then the second pshat in Rashi and Al tirgazu baderach fits in, and that is that Yosef is telling his brothers not to get angry as they travel back to Canaan. And this is where Nelson Mandela's death fits in also. Because Nelson Mandela was a freedom fighter for a black-governed South Africa for many years, and he was jailed by the white establishment for 27 long years. Now you can expect when world pressure mounted and Nelson emerges from jail to become the president, he would avenge himself on the minority white population. Yet he was credited for bringing together the country and including the white population in his considerations. So how does a person do that? How are you jailed for 27 years and not wreak vengeance on the people that took such a big chunk out of your life? So there's a quotation that they credit Nelson Mandela with, and I think it gives us the first level of anger management. He said a person who gets angry is like a person who swallows poison and expects his enemy to die from it. Yeah? One person swallowing the poison, and he's ridiculous enough to think by me swallowing poison, the other person's going to die. Obviously only hurting himself. That's what happens with anger. When I get angry at somebody else, I feel uncomfortable. He doesn't feel it at all. So all I'm doing is, I'm torturing myself. We find this idea in Chazal, Gemara, and Pesachim, and Kuf Yud Gimel Amud Beis, 113b. Whoever is angry is experiencing hell in this world, and his life is not a life. There's a comment of the Medrash Shmuel on Avos, in which he says, an angry person doesn't taste the food he eats. He doesn't know what he's doing. He himself is disgusting, he hates himself, and his friends think he's disgusting. His wife and kids distance themselves from him, and he doesn't care about his parents, his brothers. He curses God. And he closes off by saying, woe is the person who always has to ask for forgiveness. Because we know that people that have short fuses, if they explode, go around asking forgiveness for those people that they've hurt. So we understand on a basic level, the way to control road rage is to realize I'm only hurting myself. And certainly when we see what happens on the highways with somebody that's cut off, really endangers himself and his passengers by trying to cut off the other guy, so obviously we see it right in front of our eyes, how dangerous and self-destructive rage is. Parshas Vayigash, though, I believe introduces us to a higher level of anger management. If we look at Yosef's conversation with his brothers when he seeks to console them, it's very strange. He assures his brothers he's not angry with them. He says it's all part of God's plan. It's God that sent them to Egypt. They should achieve the salvation of the family. The brothers were merely instruments of the divine will. Now, we understand if Yosef has such an outlook, he's not going to get angry at his brothers. But is it real? Are his brothers blameless because that's divine will? Is that really the way Jews are supposed to think? As a matter of fact, wasn't that the defense of Adolf Eichmann's lawyers? The lawyers claimed it's inconceivable that a human being should be able to orchestrate the murder of 6 million Jews. It must be the divine will. So what do you want from Mr. Eichmann? We know that nobody bought that and Eichmann was hung. So how could divine will be the defense of Yosef for his brothers? How could he believe that? As a matter of fact, does anybody believe it? The brothers didn't seem to believe it because they were fearful that Yosef would punish them after Yaakov died, as we learn in the next parasha. The later rabbis didn't believe it because we find within rabbinic thinking that the 10 martyrs, the Asar Harugei Malchus, whose death we read in a tearful manner on both Yom Kippur and Tisha B'Av, they were punished because of the 10 brothers selling Yosef. And this has to do, of course, with reincarnation to try to understand why they were held accountable. But that's a little bit beyond us. But we understand that in rabbinic thinking, the brothers were guilty. Additionally, we find the Medrash in Esther Rabbah that when Haman and Achashverosh Yoshvu Lishtos, they sat down to eat and to celebrate, Va'ir Shushan Navocha, the city of Shushan was mourning because of the proclamation to kill the Jews. The Medrash says it was payback for the 10 brothers who sat down to eat after selling Yosef. So it's clear that Yosef's excuse for the brothers doesn't seem to be valid. So we have a question on Yosef. We have a further question on David HaMelech, because 7 centuries later we find a similar idea. David HaMelech is 67 years old, and his son Avshalom revolts. And initially the revolt is successful, and David goes into exile. In Shmuel Beis, in Perek Tes Zayin, Pasuk Hey, chapter 16, verse 5, it describes David HaMelech going into exile. And as he's traveling in mourning, Shimi ben Gera confronts the king's entourage with curses, biting curses, as explained by the Malbim. Now, what's the king's response? Well, the king's companion Avishai asks permission from the king to kill Shimi ben Gera, and David's response is, let him curse because God has told him he should curse me. It's the same problem. Because it's divine will, that excuses Shimi ben Gera for acting in an insulting manner to the king of Israel. By David, the question becomes even stronger, because we find that when David is on his deathbed giving instructions to his son Shlomo, he commands Shlomo to arrange for the execution of Shimi ben Gera. as we find in Malachim Aleph, in the second parak in the 8th pasuk. What happened to the excuse? He said it was divine will. So I think that the answer lies in the Sefer HaChinuch. The Sefer HaChinuch says the person should realize that everything that happens to him is b'hashkach, is by divine will. The pain that's coming to him is pain that's destined to come to him because of his averos. And the Chinuch uses the example of David being cursed by Shimei ben Gera. Now, if that's divine will, so where is the fault of Shimei and where is the fault of the brothers? The answer is that there are two parts. There's the way a person thinks about how he's being affected and the way others act. Yosef and David understood that any pain that they get is destined from Shemaim to be the pain. Now, the fact the person who chose to be the instrument of God inflicting that pain is guilty, that's beyond a doubt. But that's not my personal business. In other words, I shouldn't be personally enraged at another human being for inflicting the pain, because the truth is I was going to suffer anyway. So there's nothing personal here. The fact that the other person chose to be the instrument of divine will, that is his sin, and it's almost as if it's a sin that's between man and God. Notice he did something wrong. He chose to be bad. He chose to inflict pain upon another person. That was his choice, and for that he will suffer. But God will take care of that. That's not my business. That's, I believe, what Yosef is telling his brothers. As far as I'm concerned, I don't harbor any enmity to you, because whatever I suffered was part of the divine plan. So don't worry about me doing anything to you. The fact that the brothers will be punished, that's their business between them and God. By David, as long as David was alive, he also felt that whatever happens, that's divine destiny. But as he's handing over the kingdom to Shlomo, he has to establish a set of norms for how a king is dealt with. And at this point, with one foot on the grave, he decides that for the dignity of Malchus, it's necessary for Shimei ben Gera to be punished because of Shimei ben Gera's choice to be that instrument of divine will. Now David, he's on his deathbed, and he knows that this is not out of any personal feelings, because when a man has one foot in the grave, he's not going to be so protective of his own covet. And additionally, the rabbis look at a person on his deathbed as a person in tune with a higher spirituality, to the point where the Stechemid says that if a Paisik paskins Shav on his deathbed, it's not halachically binding because of Lo B'Shamayim, this is the voice of heaven. So David HaMelech waits to, at the end of his life, he has no personal agenda for self-aggrandizement, and he's connected with more spirituality. Then he can do what's necessary, not because of a personal enmity to Shimei ben Gera, because, as he said, whatever he felt, he was going to feel anyway, that pain and that insult. But Shimei ben Gera insulted the institution of kingship, and for that, David tells Shlomo he has to be executed. So this, I believe, is a very important tool in interpersonal relations. When a person's hurt by another human being, so he doesn't take it personal. If I'm being hurt, it was coming to me that I'm being hurt. The other person didn't cause or create a pain that wouldn't have come otherwise. And when I realize that, there's very little reason for road rage. Now that doesn't excuse the other person's behavior. If they call me up for a shidduch recommendation, let's say Yosef's brothers, you can say, well, it's a nice family, but they did put one of the younger brothers in the pit. That's a fact. What they did was wrong. But Yosef is telling them, I have no personal hatred against you because of what you chose to do. You'll have to straighten that out with God. When a person understands that no one can hurt him, no one can cause him pain that otherwise wouldn't have come, that not only can calm a person down, but also can help him avoid machlokas. And machlokas, we know, has been one of the tremendous tragedies for people personally, and for communities, and for us nationally. At the time when Yosef meets Binyamin, they cry in each other's necks. And Rashi comments that they were crying because they had a vision of the future destructions of the Mishkan, of the Beis HaMikdash. The obvious question is, why cry now? This is far in the future. It's possible it's because they understood that when the brothers put Yosef into the pit out of ungrounded hatred, out of sinas chinam, it wasn't just an act, it was something that affected the spiritual DNA of the Jewish nation. And that sinas chinam became part of the character of people in such a way that in future generations it will still be there like a recessive gene, and there'll be times it will cause the disease of sinna that results in the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash. And for that they're crying, because what happened in their time lays these seeds, however dormant they are, for future destruction. To illustrate this from an incident close to our time, I heard the story from Rabbi Tzal Rudinsky about one of the Dayanim from the European town of Debussy. And he said that there was a young couple that he married. They came from similar backgrounds, from the same town, and it was assumed that they wouldn't have any great shalom bayis problems. But from the time they got married, even during Sheva Brachas, machlokas started, and this went on for months, and they sought counsel, and the strangest thing was, nobody could put their finger on what the problem was. They seemed to be very nice people, and they couldn't understand why they weren't getting along. But continued to the point where the same Dayan that was Messiah Kedushin arranged a divorce, a get for them. But puzzled him for a long time, until learning about the history of Debussy, he realized that generations earlier, one of the ancestors of the chassan, of the groom, was the Rosh HaKol, the president of the community, which at that time had a lot of powers in Debussy. And the ancestor of the bride was a wannabe Rosh HaKol. He wanted that position. So he slandered the other Rosh HaKol, the sitting Rosh HaKol, and after repeating slander long enough, it becomes believed, and he was able to displace the other fellow and become the Rosh HaKol. So in that generation, there was tremendous ill feeling in machlokas. And this Dayan believes that that feeling of machlokas became embedded in the descendants, such that even though they didn't feel it consciously, but subconsciously there was still this feeling of discomfort with the other family, and generations later it still lurked in the subconscious, the collective DNA subconscious of the chas and the kala, and that's why they had to divorce. This is just one little story. We all know how destructive machlokas can be. And when Yosef cries on the neck of Binyamin, it's because they understood that what happened in their generation is now part of the future of the Jewish nation, unfortunately, unless it's uprooted. And there will be a struggle for the Jewish people to be able to live in a life of shalom without sinas chinam. Once we understand machlokas is genetic, so to speak, it will be easier to avoid it. When we understand that machlokas is a destructive force, and that the forces within ourselves are our greatest enemies to our own success and happiness, that it's an infectious disease that takes over, that we have to avoid it like the plague. I'll close with a simple parable that I heard. One rabbi pointed out that people don't usually slip and fall off the observation deck of the Empire State Building. But people very often slip off of a step. Why? Because when you're on top of the Empire State Building, you know 100% if you fall, it's destruction. And therefore you're very, very careful. But when the person is walking up steps, it's true he's careful to a certain degree, but the care is much less. Because there he doesn't think that a mistake will cost him so dearly. When couples realize that machlokas is falling off the Empire State Building to death, when families realize that, when communities realize that, and finally when the entire Jewish nation realizes that getting involved in the machlokas is falling off of the Empire State Building to a horrible, dreadful death, then we'll be more careful to control our rage as we travel on the road of life. And that's what this week's Parsha tells us about avoiding road rage. Of course, we have to take all means to keep ourselves safe in a physical manner, but in an emotional manner also. In the words of Yosef, Al tirgazu baderech, don't do anything unsafe and don't get angry, as we travel on the road of life can be tremendous advice for all of us, and it can lead us back to the promised land. Thank you.